We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go.
Well, hello, and welcome to episode 101 of the Croydon Constitutionalist podcast, bringing classical liberalism to South London and beyond via our YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts. Well, Mike and I were recently joined all the way from the United States by Lisa Ekman, the author of Deprogramming Democrats and unEducating the Elites, How I Escaped the Progressive Cult. Here is part one of our wide-ranging interview with Lisa. Lisa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Mike, you've got some questions for our guest.
I do indeed. Thanks, thanks, Lisa, for joining us. So, this book talks about how you were initially a Washington lobbyist and activist, and how you moved across to the right. But maybe just to sort of start the story off slightly, what is for those of us in the UK? It's a title we hear. What really is a lobbyist and activist in Washington? And how did you start your life as a Democrat? So over here, it's probably worth doing a comparison. You know, often people are from sort of Labour or Conservative backgrounds, but that's changed over the years. How does that compare with the States?
Sure. So I can start with that last part first. I'd be happy to tell you a little bit about myself and give an understanding of what it was I actually did. So here in the US, we really only have two political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And the Democrats are what we would consider our left-leaning party. And I would say that part of what happened is that the Democrats moved much farther to the left during my lifetime than they were when I was a kid. And Republicans are so they're more on the left. They're for bigger government. They're for expanding programs. They're for those kind of things. And those on the right they're referred to as conservatives. They want to conserve the Constitution here in the U.S. They want to keep government out essentially of everyone's daily life as much as possible, allow for a free market, which I'm not sure many countries have much of that anymore, but and have a lot of their beliefs based in the Constitution. So I think, I grew up with liberal parents, and they were what many people in the States would call JFK liberals, meaning, as I said, the Democratic Party moved very far to the left, and what my parents was sort of classical liberals at heart, and they believed in equality, and they believed in ensuring there was no legal discrimination against people, and that the left used to be the Democrats used to be what I would call a big tent. They wanted to include everyone, and not everyone within that tent agreed about everything, but they could agree to disagree. They all sort of, I guess, at the base believed that government could be helpful and help solve some of our social and economic problems in our country. So I was raised by those parents, and one of the things that was very clear in my upbringing is that there was a very high value placed on education, and so my parents believed that we could get rid of some of the class and other differences for people through education. And the more educated people would be, the better society we would have. So I grew up not questioning whether I would go to college, but where I was going to go to university, and hopefully, in my parents' eyes, where I might get some financial aid in doing that. And so I went on to not only get my bachelor's degree, but I also have a master's degree in social work. I also have a law degree that I got from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And I started out going to Washington, D.C. through a program we have here in the States that's designed to pull people with graduate level education into federal service. And through that program, I worked at a federal agency, the Social Security Administration, directly for an appointee in the Bill Clinton administration at the end of the 90s. I got there very in 1999. And so I worked directly for a political appointee. And at that agency, they're not called secretaries, but it might be for folks over there similar to maybe an undersecretary of that agency. And then I also worked directly for a couple of United States senators, including Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts. And I worked primarily on disability policy. So what does after that, I went and got my law degree, and then I became what I would call a lobbyist or an activist. And what does a lobbyist do? A lobbyist is primarily working with Congress and advocating for policies based on whoever their clients were. My clients were often nonprofit organizations, all representing people with disabilities. So I worked to expand federal programs to make them more supportive of people with disabilities. And in general, I met with members of Congress and their staff to educate them about the issues that were important to me and to advocate for them to uh, either not change the current policy because we liked it or to improve the current policy or get rid of it because we didn't. Often that involved advocating for spending more money on these programs. I also worked for government contractors when I was in Washington, D.C., helping to implement federal programs and advising on their implementation in order to improve the lives of people with disabilities, often around healthcare and employment. And so you can also be a lobbyist and advocate at federal agencies here in the States. And so I did that as well, advocating for changes. A lot of what actually gets done here in the States is not through the laws themselves, but through the regulations and the sub-regulatory policy implementing those laws. So I spent a fair bit of time reading proposed regulations, drafting comments, meeting with federal officials all the way up to the secretary level, and that kind of a thing. So basically, often lobbyists are paid by corporations or by political action committees or by lobbying firms, and they have clients who may be corporations or that type of thing, advocating often a large amount for how the pie of the federal government spending gets divided between the programs and the grants and the different industries here in the States. And just to give people a sense on how much is spent on lobbying in 2024 here in the States, $4.6 billion was spent on lobbying at Congress at the federal level. So it's a huge undertaking, and I saw that number just explode during the 20 years I was in Washington. And in fact, it went up by $1 billion between 2015 and 2024. And I think it gives a good sense of sometimes why it looks like it's a lot harder for the average citizen here in the States to get their voice heard because they're competing with all those lobbyists and all that money behind those lobbyists and activists.
Yeah, the money in the States for around politics is astonishing to sort of what we're used to over here. That's interesting. You worked for Kennedy. I don't know how much interaction with you had. With him? Any sort of impressions of him? Obviously, a famous senator.
Sure. I mean, I didn't have that many interactions with him. He had always a pretty large staff because he had been in the
Of
Senate a
course.
long time. But my experience with him was this, as much as he could, I believe he really tried to understand the average person, the average American's experience, and to really improve our country for them. The reason that I worked for him was that he was what we would have called a disability champion in our Senate. He had a relative who had an intellectual disability, and so he was very passionate about helping people with disabilities. And one thing that I can say really positive about him is that he really did believe, as a lot of people used to, in compromise for the better of the country. And he would say to staff, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. So, in other words, the very nature of compromise is nobody's getting everything they want. And so, if you have a deal on the table where you're getting a lot of what you want, but not everything, don't oppose that deal just because you think you might be able to get everything you want. And so, I think that has completely disappeared in our politics, and everything is looked at as a zero-sum game. And often, I think, sadly, um, how is this going to play for our donors as opposed to how is this actually going to affect the American people? Because in our federal election last year in 2024, almost $20 billion was spent. And that doesn't, the lobbying is separate from that. That's just on
Mm.
the election itself. And in the 45-day campaign that Kamala Harris had, she spent over $1 billion. And so I think donors have a lot to say about what many of our politicians do. But from Ted Kennedy's perspective, like I said, I think he represented a very different type of politician than we see walking the halls of Congress today.
Uh, Yeah, so funny enough, as we record this, I'm looking at a sign in my house that says "the best is the enemy of the good." A very similar kind of view. It's interesting you talk about his view about getting a deal done. I remember some years ago listening to an interview with Newt Gingrich and him talking about dealing with Bill Clinton, and he said, as much as they battled on stuff, they actually could have once they agreed on something, they would commit to it and keep to it, and they were able to negotiate to get something done. They did want to get something done, and he juxtaposed that to the time he was talking. I think was one of the lockdown, or sorry, the shutdowns under Obama administration, where he felt neither side actually was interested in getting anything done, and that's yeah, it's a sad that it's moved that way. Obviously, your book's about how so that's a bit about your background, how you've moved away from that worldview, which is I think we would recognize here from a lot of uh people in and around government in this country as well, to something that's very very different. So you start off there talking about education. Obviously you've spent a lot of time yourself in the university system. um y- you mentioned in your book about that being a tool of ideological conformity. Kind of where do you think that starts, and what form does that take, that you've seen?
Yeah, I think that really starts, I think it starts in schools, but I also think here in the States, it started back with the push towards political correctness in speech. It started with us with them trying to control the words that we can use to describe things, and then to control sort of how we think. And I think this happened on many issues that I can talk about. And one of them I can throw out there is just sort of climate change. It used to be we could have, rational science-based conversations around evidence and data about what was actually happening to our climate. And now you're just called a science denier if you don't agree 100% with the prevailing narrative about climate. And as I said, the Democratic Party used to be a big tent, and you could have a lot of different ideas about topics, and you would, at the end of the day, you might not fully agree on what the issue was, or even the solution for it, but you could all fit under that big tent because you agreed on certain basic values, or you believed in the idea that you could always make things better through the government. And like I say, all of that kind of changed. And I think it started through political correctness. And we started seeing also a real change in the way that children are educated. Part of why the title is Uneducating the Elites is that I think that we have really been programmed in the US, and sort of brainwashed through two sort of mechanisms of control. The first one would be education, and I think that starts pretty early on in our elementary schools. And I think, we could talk about, for example, the gender ideology situation with elementary schools in the United States as a good example of that. And then, goes on when you get to university and graduate schools. And, the idea in them is basically that authority is always right. The teacher is always right. You are being conditioned to show up when you're told to sit still, be quiet, and listen, and then regurgitate what has been told to you. And at some point, I think we moved from teaching young people how to think and how to critically think and how to evaluate ideas to telling them what to think. And that if they didn't regurgitate back exactly what the teacher wanted, then they would not get a good grade. If they wouldn't just comply with instructions, then they ended up getting sent to the principal's office or often being medicated in order to make them comply. And then when you get to university here in the US, over 90% of your professors are going to be Democrats. And 95% of their donations, as we were just talking about how important money is in our political system, go to Democrats. Now that will vary depending a lot, actually, depending on what your major is or what area you're studying. When you get into the hard sciences, those numbers will change somewhat. But in all of these, what I would call softer or social sciences, you're overwhelmingly being taught by uh, Democrats, people on the left, and the vast majority of them, in my experience, have some sort of belief in critical studies, which grows out of Marxism and the idea that the U.S. is actually a bad country and it needs to be deconstructed and all of its institutions destroyed and rebuilt in a different way. And so I think a lot of this came from education, started out as political correctness. And when, it used to be when I was younger, a lot younger, maybe let's say before the turn of the 21st century, if you used a word that was out of favor with political correctness, someone might tell you, hey, that's not a very nice thing to say. But then we moved, especially with the advent of social media and the internet, from, hey, that's not a very nice thing to say, to, hey, you just said something and I'm going to cancel your entire life. I'm going to try to deplatform you. I am going to potentially even try to get you debanked for what you said. And there is very little room, if any, for any straying on any of a lot of these identity politics topics and any of sort of the main ideals of the Democratic Party now. And that's why I would call it a need for ideological conformity, because if you step out of line even a little bit, um, you're often called a name that is, some sort of ism or a phobia. And it is meant to shut down the dialogue and meant to keep everyone who is a member of that party ideologically in line.
Yeah, it's funny. I got some family in the States, and some have gone through the school system, and they are, they're very well educated in on one level, and can't deny, they've had a good schooling in a lot of ways, but there are certain areas you talk about, and as you say, you're told what to say, and they repeat parrot fashion comments from their teachers in a way that, when I was at school, not repeating is what the teacher said felt like the thing to do.
Mhm.
Maybe that's why my schooling ended at quite a young age. But it's there's not an independent thought. There's not an idea that differs from the textbook, um, and that does seem to be the way. My limited experience of the U.S. education system through others. I would say over here, I think we're not quite so much like that, but I'm quite involved in schools. Uh, but what I do say is where there is a political leaning, it's always one way, and that's something we've definitely seen.
Yes, and I think it is very much the case that there is just the parroting of sort of the talking point, and I think that doesn't end once kids get out of school here. I'll often see liberals who are maybe at a protest here in the U.S. and they will, um, and I'm sorry, I shouldn't call them liberal because I think they're actually illiberal at this point. The progressives, the people on the far left, and they'll get asked a question and they can repeat the talking point that they may have heard, in the news coverage or um, in the leaflet that got sent out about the protest. But when you start to try to get them to explain underneath that talking point how they came to that conclusion or why they have that value, there isn't anything underneath that. And so I think it is very much, I think social media and the sort of echo chambers that happen within social media and the mainstream media feed into that as well.
Yeah, so funny you talk about their repeating a point. During the response to COVID-19, or as the lockdowns as we would call them here, I know they're somewhat different in the States. Um, you often saw situations where TV station after TV station would repeat the same line, the same clearly, almost a printed response given to them by government. And you'd see these screens where five or six TV stations are repeating exactly the same words, different hosts. Um, a large part of your book talks about a big change for you came in that response to COVID-19. What was it you thought about that response? What made you change from this kind of the conformity you come out of to perhaps a new way of thinking?
I think many of us here in the States would call it lockdowns also. I think a lot of people here in the States have very selective memory about what actually happened during 2020 and 2021 in terms of locking us down. And there were a couple of things that happened. I will very briefly just say that I ended up having to do a lot of research around health and what causes illness and makes people sick and what helps keep them well. When my mom was diagnosed with cancer about 4 years or about 6 years before the COVID outbreak. And the first thing that sort of, when they first, announced there's this new disease and it's really deadly and, we're going to have to make some changes regarding it. I believed everything they were telling me. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't want to kill grandma. So I was doing what they were saying. But a lot of the things that they were recommending just didn't really make sense based on that previous research that I had done. And I can give you one quick example, and that is that at the very beginning of the lockdowns, um, when we were told we were going to lock down for 2 weeks to flatten the curve, you were not allowed to leave your house unless you were an essential worker. And even if you had your own private uh, garden, your own private yard, you weren't allowed to go into it unless you were leaving your house to go for essential work. And that to me made absolutely no sense
Mm,
because, the best thing you can do for yourself is to get fresh air and sunlight. Vitamin
mm,
D is essential. So stay in your house, breathe that recirculated air. Be afraid, be very afraid. Everywhere you look, all you see is, counters of how many people have tested positive, how many deaths, and fear. Again, not great for your immune system and your health. So none of that made any sense. But the real thing that really woke me up was when the aggressive censorship started. And um, I was raised by parents who were First Amendment and free speech absolutists. And our First Amendment guarantees that the government can pass no law that will abridge our freedom of speech. And our Supreme Court has been extremely clear that when the government persuades private entities through fear, coercion, or enticement to do things that it is constitutionally prohibited to do regarding speech, that that is a violation of our First Amendment. And so when I started seeing government officials um, calling things disinformation and started to label citizens who were uh, natural healthcare practitioners that I had been following as the disinformation dozen, um, it reminded me that I was a classical liberal in my heart, that I believed 100% that if you had data and evidence to support your view, you should not be afraid of open and honest dialogue about whatever the topic may be, and that our government was censoring people. And I've always thought that the First Amendment here in the United States is what keeps us a free people. And if we lost our ability to speak freely, then we lose our ability to think freely, and then we can no longer call ourselves a free people. So the fact that a lot of the data or a lot of what they were saying, the 6 foot social distancing is another one that just there was no data or evidence to support it. And I did a lot of research, and there really wasn't any data or evidence to support it. And they've since admitted that there isn't 6 foot. It doesn't really, do anything in
No,
terms.
indeed. Can I just check what state were you in? So obviously that some of those rules, the garden ones, extreme, more extreme even than we had in the UK. What state were you in at the time?
At the time, I was in Washington, D.C. itself.
Oh, okay. So wow, those
Yeah,
Washington rules. That's quite
they
quite
were
extreme.
they were a little bit different. They closed down parks. And if I talked to someone who was in California recently during the lockdowns, and he went out in the middle of the night to walk his dog, and his neighbor turned him in, and the police came to harass him. There was no one else outside. There was,
Yeah.
but he was just walking his dog. So it was pretty extreme. And, like I said, there's a fair amount of what I would call COVID revisionism in people's memories, because a lot of people um, don't remember the whole thing about being an essential worker and basically, them saying if you were out at all during that initial period of time, police would pull you over and ask you, why are you out? And if you weren't an essential worker, they would send you home and you could get in trouble. So that really didn't make a lot of sense to me.
And also, I mean, as I understand the First Amendment, speech is part of it, and I apologize if I get this slightly wrong, but it's also freedom of expression and an inability to travel, an inability to go out is surely such a massive curtailment of that.
It 100% is, yeah. And I should say I am a First Amendment absolutist. Our First Amendment does a number of things. It gives you, and there's no explicit right to travel within our Constitution, but
No,
our
indeed.
Supreme Court has said there is a right to association and a right to assemble. And the right to travel is integral to your ability to assemble where you want to and associate with whom you want to. And then also, the other part of the First Amendment that they just gutted with absolutely no thought about it was our right to practice our religions when and where we please. And it was really hard for me to imagine that it was okay to have tens of thousands of people out protesting, but you couldn't go have Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas dinner with your family or go see your loved one in the hospital who may be dying. And those kinds of things happening without any sort of real discussion of the data and evidence that they were relying on to make these decisions. On top of which, I like to remind people here in the States that there is no public health exception to our Constitution here. And freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and association are not there in our Constitution for when it's easy. It's there for when it's hard. It's there for when we
Absolutely.
have strong disagreements. like we did during the COVID lockdowns. And so it really reminded me of those facts. And I really should look this up because every time I try to talk about it, I forget. And I know that you're facing serious challenges with freedom of speech over in the UK. Um, but when our government here in the US was essentially creating a Ministry of Truth with the Disinformation Bureau.
Mm.
It kind of jolted me awake to, you know what, that can't happen here. And if we lose our right to speak freely, we're no longer a free country. So it really jolted me awake.
Yeah, indeed. I think there's also a good rule in life that if you're setting up a department that's literally from the books of George Orwell, maybe reconsider what you're doing.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's
It was it
use
meant
that as
to
a warning
be?
sign.
Yeah. It was meant to be a warning, not a playbook, right, Mike?
Absolutely, absolutely.